Well, hello and welcome to all you viewers out there. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this policy dialogue. It's also a big pleasure to welcome you to the first in the brand new series that we have initiated called Unpacking Turkish Foreign Policy. I think there's so many interesting facets and issues related to Turkish foreign policy. I mean, Ankara seems to have a finger in every geopolitical pot, so to speak, that we decided to create a new event series looking at all the ins and outs of Turkish foreign policy and what this actually means for different partners and different parts of the world and different players. Now, given that President Trump is about to take office next week, we thought it would be very opportune to start this series with a discussion about Türkiye-US relations. I think it's fair to say that this relationship has had many ups and downs, to put it mildly. It's a relationship that suffers from structural relations. You may recall that during the last Trump presidency, the two countries actually experienced a number of significant rifts. This included Turkey's purchase of the Russian S-400 missile defense system. This is what eventually triggered US sanctions on Turkey, and also Turkey's removal from the F-35 fighter jet program. In addition to that, we've seen US support for Syrian Kurds having a major negative impact on relations. And there's been, I would say, a lot of diverging issues related to national security priorities and interests of both countries. So there's many problems to talk about. How can we resolve some of these? How can we get the level of trust back into the relationship? So we're going to have a deep dive into this relationship today. And we're very, very lucky to have two brilliant experts with us to talk about Türkiye. First of all, Alper Coşkun, who is Senior Fellow in the Europe Programme at Carnegie in Washington. He is a retired career diplomat who has more than 3 decades of extensive experience related to Turkish foreign policy, including on international and Euro-Atlantic security, transatlantic relations. Among other postings, when he was in the foreign ministry, he served at NATO, United Nations, Athens, as well as being Turkey's ambassador to Azerbaijan. So I think he's more or less covered the world or many of its issues. And we have with us Aaron Stein, who is president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Washington. Now, Aaron has previously worked at many of the best think tanks. He's previously worked at War on the Rocks, the Atlantic Council, the Geneva Center for Security Policy, as well as the Royal United Services Institute, otherwise known as RUSI, in London. So he has a vast experience as well on Turkey for many decades. So welcome to both of you. Thanks for joining us today. I'm going to start by putting a set of questions to the speakers, and then we're going to come to the audience. Please do put your questions either in the box, or you can also ask it by clicking on the, I think, on the hand icon, and you can speak to our guests vocally. So welcome again. I want to start with a general question to ask both of you how you would assess the current state of Washington's relationship with Türkiye, and where is it going? If I may, I would like to start with you, Alper.
Man, thank you very much, and good morning, good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for having me here. Good luck with this important series that I'll also be following with great interest. And it's great to be here with Aaron, who is someone who I also follow and learn a lot from. Well, you laid out some of the challenges, I think, that are affecting the Turkish-US relationship. This is a long-standing alliance relationship, but one that is obviously not in a good place nowadays. When you speak to any expert who has knowledge on the history of Turkish-US relations, you will hear almost all of them say that this has never been an easy relationship, that there have been challenges always along the way, and many will cite the beginning of sort of the initial signs of significant rifts between Turkey and the United States to the Johnson letter of the 1960s in relation to Turkey's attempt at the time to intervene in Cyprus and so on. So, there's a long legacy, a lot of challenges, but I think what's different nowadays is the two countries seem mostly to have lost the middle ground where they used to be able to meet no matter what. And I think there's a lot to be said for both sides and the degree to which they, I think, have succumbed to centrifugal forces, not only because of a result of changes within the United States, within Turkey itself, but also changes in the international landscape that, you hear this mentioned quite often in different contexts as well, but I think it's very relevant in the Turkish-US context. The end of the Cold War and the withering away of that bonding effect of the Soviet Union of the time, I think has really brought about a lot of untapped potential, but at the same time created circumstances in which both Turkey and the United States were pursuing different priorities, which did not necessarily overlap. And that's where I think convergences increasingly decreased, and you had a number of rifts that emerged, particularly, I think, the effects of the US invasion in Iraq in 2003, which Turkey saw to be extremely disruptive in the neighborhood. I remember the conversations we had with the US side at the time, insisting that it would be very detrimental for the long-term security and stability of the region to gut out the Iraqi regime at the time. That was done, nevertheless. And then, of course, Turkey, in its own view, is still suffering the consequences in terms of regional instability that now has spiraled down, obviously, to Syria. And the two countries find themselves, interestingly enough, in many places actually pursuing similar goals. I would argue also in Syria, but really using different tools to reach those goals. Turkey partnering with Russia and Iran until recently in the context of Syria, for example, to offset what it saw as a disruptive influence of the United States because of its partnering with the PKK elements, as Turkey sees it in Syria, is a great example of that. And of course, I think you also have a significant change in Turkey's outlook to both its own region and beyond, but also the way in which under President Erdogan, Turkey has been pursuing what some refer to as strategic autonomy, to borrow a word from France, right? You see Turkey not too worried about going afoul with its allies in some of its policy choices. We saw that rather recently in the context of Sweden and Finland wanting to join NATO, where Turkey raised some national issues. The Turkish rhetoric there was, well, other countries do the same. Greece was an example that was often given in the context of its objection to Northern Macedonia's joining the alliance, for example. But of course, some of the things that I think are not filtered enough in Turkey's policy and decision-making, as in this example, is the context in which these things take place. Sweden and Finland is a great example, in my view, of an issue where Turkey had some legitimate concerns as far as Sweden and Finland's policies are concerned, but it raised them at a point in time in which the geopolitical dynamics in the Euro-Atlantic landscape had dramatically shifted after Russia's attack. These two countries, Sweden and Finland, had decided to join NATO. Huge paradigm shift. And there you have Turkey objecting to that. So all these, together with democratic backsliding and examples that you mentioned, such as the S-400 acquisition, I think have left an accumulated bitter taste in the eyes, in the feelings of the United States. And now you have a situation in which I think the landscape in the United States is as less amenable as I've ever known it to be to belief in that this is a relationship that is worth investing in. And I think that is a problem. Turkey's obviously deteriorating relations with Israel. Its implications for the lobby and in the United States is also an important element. So you have a huge series of events that I think have all create a situation in which really that middle ground has been lost. And I think both sides have been significantly complacent in not investing in the relationship enough. The Biden era, in my view, was a good example to that. I guess we'll talk about the opportunities and challenges in the Trump era, but I think Turkey is walking into this upcoming administration in the United States with some cautious optimism that at least there will be more engagement and opportunities to work with the United States in some areas.
Thank you, Alper, for this very comprehensive assessment. It sounds to me like you're saying that Turkey has been, is dancing to its own tune, if I can coin it that way, over the last few years. But I would like to ask you, Aaron, do you agree? I mean, I'm guessing you would agree to a certain degree with Alper's assessment, or maybe totally, or do you see things in a different way in any sense?
No, I largely agree. I'm a big fan of the term revealed preferences, and if we want to go back to 2003, it wasn't just Turkey. It was basically everybody who was telling the United States that this obsession with Saddam Hussein and invading Iraq was going to lead to bad things, right? Perhaps with the exception of some Arab allies who were keen for more US involvement. And the outcome of that is one of the worst case scenarios for Turkey, which is continued instability on its land borders, the disruption of trade. And then the most acute, of course, is the sort of the revival of the Kurdish issue, which we can talk about at the hands of a third party or external actor. I think the largest change in Turkish security policy after the collapse of the Soviet Union was the capture of Abdullah Öcalan and sort of the ability of the country to rely on two stable anchors, regardless of their democratic outlook, in that case being the changes that the Assad regime, now deposed, made towards its relationship with the PKK, and then the sort of, let's say, the relationship between the Barzanis and Saddam Hussein at the time, and the ability to crack down on the PKK as well. And if you were sitting in Ankara, the United States came and screwed that all up. And so I imagine that the entirety of the political apparatus, as well as the security apparatus, remains entirely upset about this. And then compounded on top of this is that when the ISIS problem emerged, which Ankara will probably blame on the United States for its invasion in 2003, the US made the ultimate sin, which was to partner with the Syrian affiliate of the PKK. Now, the US did so out of largely ignorance, largely by accident, and this policy is sort of grown up in supporting what we now call the SDF in Syria as sort of one of those bureaucratic accidents that often happen in the United States, which we often just look at and go, our government is so stupid. But when you look at like people who live in the region, there are real consequences towards the actions of the United States. And so if you are an AKP or you are an Erdogan who's been in power now for, how long has he been in power? 21 plus years. This is, I like to say, he lived through Bush, he lived through Obama, he lived through Trump 1, he lived through Biden, and then he'll probably live through Trump 2. So this is his 5th US president. He's seen this movie before. He knows how it ends. He's not exactly afraid of the Oval Office in ways I think he was back in 2003. And so as he executes his foreign policy, I think he's a very confident person in how he views the region. I think he has a lot of self-reassurance that his points of view are correct. And those points of view oftentimes diverge from those of the United States. But I think he's smart enough to know that cooperation is preferred, but he'd like to see it constructed in ways that is beneficial to Turkey. Now, this is very normal in terms of how leaders interact. I think the difference with Erdogan is he's been around so long. And so if I were to judge the relationship as it is now, I would call it stable instability, meaning that both sides recognize that the countries don't really get along too much anymore. Both sides at the fundamental level understand that there's really no breaking of ties because of the NATO link. And this includes Trump as well. Both sides very well understand the issues. It's Syria, it's broader regional issues, but we're really talking about Syria. It's the relationship with Russia and the S-400 as a sort of outgrowth of that. and two, the mechanisms to deal with this. And one, there's the Turkish bureaucracy loves these working groups, and so the working groups are active. There was one that was just out there, talking about the future of Syria, and I think a very good understanding of sort of the uncertainty that the Trump era will bring. I think Ankara is cautiously pessimistic. I think the sort of reading of Ankara as like welcoming Trump is wrong. I think that they understand that this is a bit of a wild card for this reason and this reason only. The first time we did this, the two men had a good rapport, but because Donald Trump is fundamentally sort of disinterested in the actual governance of the United States, things that they would agree to, at least verbally, would never get transmitted down the US side. And so that's where it would always get mucked up. And so Trump and Erdogan would reach some sort of agreement. Nobody really knew if that agreement was actually policy. Policy was never executed. And so you had just chaos and dysfunction on the US side, where on the Turkish side, you have a very buttoned up bureaucracy that functions much better than ours does currently. And so that's where I see the sort of pessimism coming from the Turkish side. I think they understand that Trump probably wants to disentangle itself from Syria, probably wants to figure out a way to remove itself from Iraq, as the Biden administration has agreed to, and the Trump administration before that. But how that actually functions is where I think Ankara is preparing for some bumps in the road as they move forward, and all of the stuff that links on to that.
Thank you, Aaron. I'm not sure that Erdogan is the only one that sees Trump as a wild card. I think everybody in Europe sees him as something, as a wild card. But I'd like to come back to you now, Alper, to talk about Trump 2.0. I mean, what do you think is going to be the main differences between Trump and Erdogan the first time around and this time around? And you raised the issue about the S-400, Aaron. There seems to be a lot of talk about a potential solution for this. I mean, I heard being placed in the Incirlik base. Is this something that's at all probable? And if that was to happen, to what extent would this help to improve relations, as it seems to be a major problem? I'll come to you, Alper, please.
Sure. I think the main sort of assessment or expectation vis-a-vis a Trump administration is Erdogan's ability, based on his previous experience, to reach out and find Trump on the other end of the phone when he wants to. He's already done that recently, and the problem there is exactly what Aaron mentioned, and I think that's where in some elements of the Turkish bureaucracy there's a bit of a selective memory that I think is at play, where the mere fact that Erdogan has been able to speak to Trump goes down and builds an expectation that that's something good. But exactly as Aaron described, and I witnessed this, many of those conversations and the content of those conversations never translated into policy on the US side. So that second aspect of that engagement is unfortunately forgotten. So that's where the real wild card is. Nevertheless, I think in hindsight of the Biden experience, I understand the selective memory on the part of Turkey, because at least in the Trump case, there was that engagement at the highest level. And that's how the Turkish state structure under this executive presidential system now functions. It's more important now that Erdogan talks to these leaders as opposed to any bureaucracy, even ministerial level engagement with other actors. So in that sense, there's an opportunity. If Trump and Erdogan can build synergy in some areas, then the relationship may move forward. And I think the biggest expectation, again, as both you and Aaron mentioned, is in the context of Syria. Will Trump follow up with his previous attempt to pull out of Syria? But I think that's where deeper thinking is required, because the US moving out of Syria isn't going to exactly solve the problem. There will be other aspects of that Turkey and the United States will need to consider. First and foremost, the worry of the resurgence of ISIS, what will happen to the camps and so on. And I think those are areas where Turkey is hoping to have a serious engagement with the US side that it has not been able to have with the Biden administration. Most of the formulas that would need to be implemented are pretty much the same. The context has changed now that Assad's gone and the HTS is in power. But at the end of the day, if Turkey is to sort of fill the gap that will be left by the US leaving the theater, if that is to take place, then what needs to be done is pretty much known. So it's more about the expectation to have an engagement that overlaps in terms of the end goal, which is ending the US's support to the PKK affiliates as Turkey sees them. But I don't think that on the US side there is yet enough understanding of how that transition may take place. And that's where I think Turkey will need to do a lot of work to satisfy Washington, even in the Trump era, if that is to be the case. I'll leave the S-400 to Aaron. I think you asked that to him.
Yeah, thank you, Alper. I'll give the floor back to you, Aaron, to answer on the S-400, but also maybe to comment whether there's any, I mean, is there any informal contact between the incoming guys and Erdogan's team? I mean, on Syria and some issues, I guess probably there are, I mean, to get a head start on some of this.
I mean, we see what's reported, but the last time this happened, you know, anybody in Turkey, and they're the families with names that we all know, and I'll just leave it at that, who have interactions with Trump through his businesses, are offering themselves up now as potential conduits to get inside his head. So I know somebody who knows somebody who has this self. Look, and so sure, I'm sure there's all sorts of very affluent Turks who know people in Trump's orbit who are offering themselves up as ways to explain Turkish policy to Washington, which can therefore sort of unlock the magic key. I don't think we should be naive this time around. The Turkish government had a very good understanding of Donald Trump the first time. They were able to overlook his Islamophobia and the people that he was putting around him, excuse me, to understand that this was a sort of, I don't want to call him practical, but somebody who could be influenced, you know, through direct leader-to-leader outreach. Whoever did that assessment of Trump back in probably October of 2016 or September 2016 did a very good job, did a better job than I did. And so when they were coming in the transition, they knew what buttons to push. Now, as this applies to the S-400, it did manifest itself in the S-400. The S-400 thing, CATSA, was a US reaction to Donald Trump's potential lifting of sanctions on Russia for its intervention in the election he won in 2016. It was never aimed at Turkey. It was the idea that Trump could not unilaterally lift US sanctions placed on Russia. Now, the context, of course, has changed. The idea of the US lifting sanctions on Russia now in 2025 is silly. And he hasn't even floated it. But CATSA was a binding thing that says if a third party does business with a sanctioned Russian entity, they are liable to third party sanctions without the presidential waiver that is typically included. I remember when this legislation came through, I mean, I can say it now, it's been 10 years, the military attaché in Ankara emailed me and said, quote, "What is this?" The US military, because this is going to cause a lot of problems. And I said, "You got me." And then at that point, more and more people said, I can be the third party mediator. There was all sorts of businessmen or people who said that they could explain this. And there was an effort to try and undo elements of CATSA, not for Turkey. It was for Germany in Nord Stream 2. And so there was elements to do this. And if you remember, Germany got a cutout. Now, fast forward to 2025. Nord Stream 2 no longer exists, right? And so the elements that would apply towards US sanctions remain, the really sticky ones are gone, with the exception of S-400. In the intervening years, the US law precludes Turkey's inclusion again in the F-35 program. I'm not passing judgment on this. I think CATSA is the dumbest piece of legislation that's ever been passed, but it is what it is. The NDA thereafter is what it is. So in order to get back into the F-35 program, the US law would have to be changed. in favor of Turkey. And then that Alper was talking about things like Israel. You interject all of these third-party issues that would get congealed and screwed up because of the sort of tensions in the bilateral relationship. But it was the Trump administration that proposed the compromise that for some reason the Turks are talking about again, and that has been on every single agenda meeting throughout the Biden administration. Stick the S-400 in one place, which it already is at. You know, you can just watch these things on commercial satellite imagery. I have a strange fetish with watching Turks move the S-400 around an airbase. And don't deploy it. It's the same thing. It's been around now going on 6 years. I hope there's movement, because this is the dumbest military purchase in the history of the US-Turkey relationship. And CATSA itself as a law is incredibly stupid. Only Congress could write such a dumb law. And so I'd like us to move past this issue, but it requires Ankara doing something, and then it requires trust that the US would reciprocate, which goes straight back to the point that we talk about, which is neither side wants to do this because it's just easier to sit there and scream at each other rather than make a compromise. So I hope they put it in, put it wherever you want. It fundamentally doesn't matter. Lock it away. And then perhaps we can then discuss future pathways, either to purchase the F-35. I don't think Turkey wants to purchase the F-35. They changed decisions, and we can talk about that if you want. But it can undo that really stupid sanctions on SSB to allow for the types of cooperation that could enhance those sort of institutional ties that I think all of us who follow this relationship would like to rebuild. Independent of Turkey's procurement decisions, because that's something different.
Thank you, Aaron. This is truly fascinating stuff. And I want to just stay with the S-400s a second, but come to you, Alper, because I'm just wondering if the fact this hasn't really moved yet is also to do with Turkey's relationship with Russia. Is that an element here, or am I just, you know, creating, you know, problems where they don't exist?
I think yes and no is the answer. You know, the important thing in my view, vis-a-vis the S-400, which I totally agree with Aaron, was the stupidest thing that Turkey's done to itself. The important element in my view is the fact that Turkey hasn't actually operationalized this. It did the test run and it's been kept in a box. And this is important to remember when you think of the rhetoric that Turkey was deploying at the time, that I remember very well personally as well, being obliged to use that rhetoric, which was that Turkey was in an urgent need of this type of an air defense system because of the regional challenges and risks and threats that it faced. Well, you know, it's been so many years since it's been purchased and it hasn't been operationalized, so that obviously wasn't the case. That in itself, I think, proves the fact that there is room for movement on this. And it's quite clear that Ankara and Washington have been dancing around the idea a little bit. How Russia would react will always be a consideration as far as what Turkey does with the S-400. But I think one significant change has occurred since Turkey's acquisition, and that is the image of Russian defense equipment, which when Turkey bought this was sort of, you know, on an upward trajectory as far as outside perceptions are concerned because of what it was doing in Syria. In fact, Syria was often mentioned as a theater in which Russia was showing off its military capabilities. Well, Ukraine has proved to be just the opposite. And I think that has really undermined the visceral desire in some quarters in Turkey to partner Turkey's defense industry and its future with the potential that they thought existed in Russia. That is no longer the case. And I think that is another element which leads me to believe that Turkey is closer to solving this. And again, I totally agree with Aaron. You know, they just need to come around the table and decide to move forward. The significant element, I think, is in the NDAA, where Turkey needs to cease possession, according to the wording there. If a solution to that expression can be found, I think Turkey and the United States, if there's a will, there will be a way for them to solve this issue and to move forward. What will that do? I don't think I agree with Aaron again, I don't think Turkey's that interested in the F-35, maybe a smaller purchase might be something Turkey might consider, given the changing balance of air power in the region, particularly vis-a-vis Greece. But I don't think that in its long-term projections, that is a priority as it was in the past for Turkey. But if the S-400 is solved and the CATSA issue is solved, I think what that could do potentially is open new avenues of cooperation between Turkey and the United States in defense industry, where Turkey's, since the acquisition of the S-400, made significant strides. And I think there are areas where Turkey and the United States can really build synergies. I see this in the development of certain automated weapons systems in Turkey, smaller types of engines for cruise missiles, for example. So there's an interesting potential in Turkey that I think can be utilized in synergy with the United States, and that could open that path. Thank you.
Thank you, Alper. I just want to stay on the topic of potential low-hanging fruit. I mean, we've mentioned 2 or 3 of them now, or is there any of our areas where you could see low-hanging fruit for a sort of quick improvement in ties between Washington and Ankara? I mean, if it's in the region or something else.
Is that for me?
Yeah.
Oh gosh. No, I think the issues are very challenging. Because I'll use the Syria example. The SDF sort of made up that the French would patrol the border, right, in Syria, as a potential conduit to forestall a potential Turkish invasion. Now, that was never real policy. That was the SDF just making up something. But the Turkish foreign minister's response to it, I thought, was really interesting. If you strip out the sort of, we're a big, powerful state and France is not a powerful state, so mind your own business, France, sort of, which made me chuckle. He mentioned something that's very challenging, which is that the countries should repatriate the foreign fighters that are stuck in Syria basically in purgatory. And this is the challenge. Trump and Erdogan can agree literally on day one that US troops will leave Syria. There's only 900 of them, between 900 and 2,000. The number is fundamentally irrelevant. There's a small number of US troops that fluctuate between Iraq, Jordan, and Syria, and Kuwait. There are thousands of passportless foreigners sitting under SDF and US protection, or I guess internment. And Ankara typically floats that they could absorb the responsibility for these people. Now, there's really never any details behind that. But do you think the United States hasn't been asking, say, Russia, Kazakhstan, Turkey, others to take these people back for the past 7 years? Do you think that this is something that hasn't been on the agenda of American foreign policy for a very long time, and countries refuse? And so when you ask about low-hanging fruit, people always say, well, Trump can pull out of Syria, Erdogan can get it, and everything will be great. It's not that easy. It will require a lot of work on what to do with these 100, I think it's 60,000 plus people. And Fidan said countries should take them back. I wish it was that easy. So that's one. The S-400 thing is something that could be, because it was, again, it was the Trump compromise because he wanted to sell the F-35. He never quite understood the idea of the F-35 consortium. Sure, that could come back, but I don't think Turkey wants to buy the F-35. Everything Turkey is doing in its defense procurement around air power is freeing up money. It's basically cutting money to be able to subsidize and build its own domestic fighter, which I don't think will be ready till the mid-2030s. But you can just follow the money and you can see what they're doing. And so they're not going to turn around and then come begging to the United States, please sell this to me, and so, they're going to use that money elsewhere. And so these issues are sticky, even if sort of people will say, well, Syria will be solved, the S-400 will solve, and Erdogan and Trump can just call each other. The number one low-hanging fruit could be just the resumption of regular phone calls. But people in the American bureaucracy don't like the idea of regular phone calls between Trump and Erdogan because Trump doesn't stick on talking points. And so my guess is we'll try to work against it. And then the final thing I'll say is that the legacy of the Iraq war on the Turkish side is what it is. The legacy of the Iraq War on the US side is different. Senior levels, people in the Trump administration all spent time in Iraq. They all had people they know get killed in these roadside bombs, a lot of which now were in some ways, right, carried out by the current governors of Syria. And so while I think we all agree that Bashar leaving is very good, there will be a lot of skepticism about who these people are. And a lot of people will remember them from their Camp Bucca days. And they're tying up with what we then called Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And so there's a lot of sticky things that will have to be issued along with, I mean, we haven't even talked about Russia, along with the future of Black Sea security, Russia, although I think the Trump administration is far closer to the Turkish position than the Biden administration was. So that could be places of cooperation, actually, but we'll see.
Great, thank you, Aaron. I'm going to come to the questions in a second, but I want to put a last question to you, Alper, basically related to what you just mentioned about security, Black Sea security, Russia, European security, because President Trump has been threatening for a long time to reduce US presence on the eastern flank. Asking the allies to pay more. I think he's at 5%, is it? He's asking 5% of is it 4 or 5% of GDP. But if we look at the role of Turkey on the eastern flank, I mean, it's already playing quite an important role, or a very important role, in European security. So wouldn't it be sort of a natural step for Turkey to actually play a bigger role in boosting European security, particularly if we're going to see a reduction in the US presence there? Is that something that you see could potentially happen in the upcoming period or years? I mean, here in Brussels, it doesn't seem to be that popular, but I'd be interested to hear your views on that, and also the potential role of Turkey in some sort of future ceasefire agreement vis-a-vis the war in Ukraine, when we would get to that point. I mean, obviously we're a long way from that yet, but we're going to get there at some point. And again, Turkey seems to be a natural partner in that region.
Look, on all these issues, from Syria to Iraq to Black Sea security, what Turkey can do if there's a ceasefire in Ukraine, and broader European security, I think there are a lot of sticking points. There are a lot of political challenges that need to be overcome. Nothing is straightforward. But if you take a step back from those complexities, I'm a little bit more optimistic in terms of low-hanging fruit between Turkey and the United States. If both sides agree on a new paradigm in their relationship, the US has to come to terms with the fact that that Turkey no longer will fall in line as the United States wants it to do. Turkey no longer refers to itself as a loyal ally. I find that degrading, that expression. Turkey has interests of its own, and it will stand up for its interests. That is the rhetoric, and that is understandable in my view. But this is a reality that I think the United States needs to grapple with and sort of shed its superpower reflexes, if you will, when it's engaging Turkey. And in the same spirit, Turkey has to understand and come to terms with the fact that the United States will pursue different policies in and around Turkey, particularly, that Turkey will not be very happy about. This may be in Syria, as is the case right now. It may be the increasing level of cooperation between the United States and Cyprus and Greece and so on. So these handicaps in the relationship are, I think, the new norm. The trick will be whether Washington and Ankara will be able to manage this better and find convergences. And if they are able to manage these difficulties better, then I think there is middle ground to meet in. And I think Syria is still, despite all the challenges and the justifiable ones that Aaron mentioned are there, I think there is still middle ground to work on. And I would broaden that. If you look at the implications of what's happened in Syria, and particularly vis-a-vis Iran's regional influence, there is congruence, though Turkey will not say it in so many words, between US interests, even Israeli interests, and Turkey's interests in that regard. I would say the same vis-a-vis the erosion, if you will, of Russian power in the region. And in terms of low-hanging fruit, does that open a door possibly in the Southern Caucasus, where Turkey might take a bolder step in terms of encouraging Armenia and Azerbaijan towards peace? Is that something that the Trump administration might see as a low-hanging fruit, as one of my colleagues from Carnegie recently wrote about in the Wall Street Journal? I think there's potential there. I also believe even in the Black Sea, where Turkey and the United States are traditionally seen to be looking at the security of the region from different perspectives, if the mindset can be changed, there's a lot of overlap that Turkey and the United States can work on together. So I would argue the same vis-a-vis Ukraine if there were to be some form of a ceasefire. This is an area where, both in terms of reconstruction and the monitoring, if it comes to that, of the ceasefire, are areas where Turkey will be very interested in having a role. Because of increasing its regional clout, but also because of the economic opportunities that it will see in that. But again, you run into the political difficulties, because if Europe is to have a strong say in how these things transpire, including in the future of Euro-Atlantic security, if the United States is to withdraw to a certain element from that equation, will Paris, for example, will Berlin, for example, have the appetite to have Turkey have a more sort of visible role in taking decisions on how European security is orchestrated? Obviously, it's a NATO member, but if the weight is going to shift towards the European Union, which is a long shot currently, but if that is the idea, then how do you put Turkey into that equation? Currently, I do not see that appetite on the part of Brussels, and I think it's a little bit of strategic myopia, not finding a way to work with Turkey in these areas, because Turkey does have an ambition to do that.
Thank you, Alper. I'm going to take some of the questions that we have in the chat box now. We'll start off with the anonymous. How can Trump's tariffs impact the relationship? I don't know which one of you would like to have a go at that.
Yeah, I'll just say, I believe in the first Trump administration, there were the steel tariffs. Am I remembering that correctly, Alper? Which was a lot like what he's threatening to do now, which is to use the threat of economic coercion, a lot like a sanction to try and influence policy. In this case, it was around Pastor Brunson, another sort of silly detour in the evolution of US-Turkish relations. Look, we don't know what Trump's tariff policies will actually look like. If they are implemented as he says, they'll be quite bad for the US domestic consumer. I'd say less so for Turkey. But if they're implemented in the way that they're hinting about in leaks, I think that there will be room for maneuver on both sides to figure out ways, negotiate, carve outs is what I expect. But in general, tariffs are a bad thing. We all learn this in basic economics. I think both leaders, I should say, needed to refresh their understanding of basic economic theory. One in terms of what drives, well, both in terms of what drives inflation. So in that case, it could be a point of convergence for the two sides, and that they don't understand basic macro and macroeconomics. But nothing good will come of tariffs in a broad sense in general for the United States, and that will obviously impact Turkey.
Thanks, Aaron. We have a question here from Andreas Metasas, who is asking whether Turkey sees Trump as an important to creating its Mavi Vatan. This is famous blue homeland policy. And what about the comments from Devlet Bahçeli about taking the 7 islands back? Can you take that, Alper?
Sure. Look, this blue homeland thing it gets more attention outside of Turkey than it does inside Turkey. And I understand the reasons why, particularly in countries like Greece. There is a certain constituency that is passionately interested in the idea. I think the logic of Turkey as a regional actor, 3 sides of the country surrounded by waters, to be interested in pursuing its interests in these regions, right? That in itself is legitimate, but the way in which some people who are the architects of the blue homeland idea in Turkey are playing with these really do not correspond to reality in many ways. So I wouldn't read too much into that. I also wouldn't read too much into what Bahçeli is saying. He's appealing to a domestic audience. This is unfortunately something that is done also in Greece and in that part of the world. So when I listen to Fidan, when I listen to Erdogan now in the past couple of years, in comparison to the statements that were coming out of Ankara vis-a-vis Greece. I think, though all the problems remain, at least both sides seem to be managing the relationship with more responsibility. And it is on a better course where engagement is taking place on these issues. There's a significant disparity in the way in which Turkey describes the list of problems that it thinks needs to be addressed as opposed to how Greece does. Obviously, those issues continue, but the management of the relationship has become better. So I wouldn't read too much into those statements coming out of Bahçeli in those circles.
Yeah, Bahçeli loves to make those sorts of statements, has been doing that for many decades. We have a question here from, I think, Ferdus Intaj, and I apologize if I pronounce that incorrectly. He's saying that Serbia is trying to play the role of mediator between Trump and Putin. Could Turkey also do that? Aaron?
It's a lot like those wealthy Turks who all try and play the third party. Since the start of let's say the second Ukraine war, there's been no number of countries that have offered to play mediator. Serbia's one, Israel's one, Turkey is one. You know, there's a much longer list, you know, in terms of playing mediator. If there is any movement in the two sides towards a resolution or at least a ceasefire in Ukraine, it will come directly via the US and Russia. No third party mediator is needed. You know, there could be some sort of no, I mean, I'll just leave it at that. There is no need for a third party mediator on the two sides. It will happen through the direct outreach via appointed people. Who will negotiate these terms, probably over the head of the Ukrainians. But I don't know if Alper has a different point of view, actually having been in government, unlike me.
No, I actually totally agree with you, Amanda. If I may, I also want to make the point, I don't think Putin will want to give the glory of mediating with the United States to anyone, and in particularly to Turkey. He will not do so, especially also in the aftermath of Syria recently. You know, it was a couple of months back when spokespeople on the part of Turkey were talking about an imminent Putin visit to Turkey. That never happened. The relationship is not where it used to be. And, you know, I hear so many people talking about the relationship as an alliance between Turkey and Russia. I understand where they're coming from when they say that, but it is a very complex relationship that continues on very thin ice. And I think the ice has gotten thinner recently. So I don't see that chance happening.
But staying on this topic, how could Europeans ensure that they're actually at the table? Because this is the question that is being posed now. I mean, can they force themselves onto the table in some way? Because they need to be there, because this is about European security. And I don't believe it's also possible to force any sort of agreement on Ukraine or a ceasefire on Ukraine.
Europe, we talk about Europe as a single entity, but it's not, right? So each country has their own individual interests, and that's ultimately like what upends the formulation of a coherent European foreign policy. I think France is the closest in terms of actually interjecting European leverage into this conversation, but I have a lot of doubts about the ability of France to marshal a European peacekeeping force to go into Ukraine along the lines that President Macron has suggested. Look, I think the European-US relationship, which is often how we view sort of like the world, is obviously in for a radical change. And I don't think it will actually be as mismanaged as the first Trump administration. Europeans will be asked to spend, I mean, the number is 5%, but like more than 2% of their GDP on defense. 5% is completely unattainable, but the more realistic number of 3.5% for most of these countries is also politically unattainable. That's how tariffs can come into play on the US side. That's what underpins all the silliness about Greenland, Canada, and Panama. Well, Panama is a different case. That's about Chinese Belt and Road. And so, and then Trump would like to see a decrease in the US presence in Europe, and his sort of more polished subordinates have also made the same case. So you could see a corresponding increase in US presence in the Indo-Pacific. So if Europe actually wanted to play a more pronounced role in the resolution, in air quotes, or inverted commas to use the UK, of Ukraine, the Trump administration is simply going to just use a cane to beat them to try and spend more money on defense. And until they do that, I don't think there'll be a lot of appetite in the US to take European positions all that seriously at the high level. Obviously, at the sort of professional civil service, there'll be a lot of paper churn and meetings to discuss the European perspectives. But Trump is going to try and push really hard for a ceasefire, because that's exactly what he told us during the campaign.
Great. Thank you, Aaron. We have a question here from Mose Apliat, who's asking, do the US and Turkey agree on the analyse and its role in the future of Syria? Would you like to take that? Which one? Alper?
Aaron, go ahead. Aaron, go ahead. I'll tag on after.
I mean, the basic US position on this is that leave this to HDS and the SDF to solve on their own without third-party intervention. That's the current position as being articulated through the US-Turkish working group. There's no need for Turkish intervention. It will make things worse. So let the two sides discuss it. I imagine that will be the same position in the Trump White House as well. It's the most obvious solution to this. I think the Turks have accepted this for now. So yes, in a strange way, I do think that there is US and Turkish agreement on how this needs to be resolved. Obviously, the devil will be in the details. What is the future status of the SDF within a Syrian state? How do they fit into the future Syrian military to the point where we can call it that? And how does this link towards internal developments in Turkey? It's very murky, to be completely honest with you. But at the 30,000-foot level, yes, I actually think there is agreement right now on what to do.
You want to add something, Alper, on this?
Yeah, maybe it's just useful to remember, I think Hakan Fidan sort of laid out a pathway that Turkey expects in this regard, which is the requirement for the foreign fighters that have been affiliated with the PKK to leave Syria. That is sort of a first condition that Turkey seems to be talking about nowadays. The second condition is to ensure that those that have been affiliated with the PKK, whether they are Syrian or not, also to leave the ranks. And he has expressed Turkey's sort of readiness to accept the fact that the remaining bulk of that force could be integrated into the future Syrian armed forces. But just as Aaron says, the devil is in the details. How do you make that happen? And that's where the challenge will be.
Thank you, Alper.
And the challenge with those foreign fighters is that they wouldn't call themselves Turkish, but they are of Turkish nationality. And so going home is always the challenge in the sort of linking of the peace process. The peace process, the solution process, and the Syria issue. It's that if you're asking these people to leave Syria, where are they going? Because they're not actually Iraqi. Most of the cases, the foreign fighters come from a part in Turkey that just cross over a border.
Thank you, Aaron. I'm going to come back to you, Alper, to put this question actually from my colleague, Paul Taylor, about the Black Sea, because I know you've worked a lot on this topic. And he's asking, is Turkey's policy on access to the Black Sea helping the West or Russia more currently? And how could this evolve?
Yeah, I'm assuming by policy, Paul is asking the closure of the Turkish Straits after the war between Russia and Ukraine. And I think, US officials are on record saying that has helped the security situation, that has helped Ukraine indirectly by precluding Russia's ability to augment its naval presence in the Black Sea. And interestingly enough, ever since Turkey started implementing this policy, though it does not preclude the deployment of non-belligerent parties, including the United States and Western allies, to deploy in the Black Sea, no NATO ally or Western power has been pushing Turkey for access to the Black Sea. So there's, I think, an unspoken understanding that keeping the status quo, not increasing military presences in the Black Sea, has worked, to Ukraine's benefit. And I think in that sense, the policy has been welcomed, though you won't hear many vocally stating that in the West.
Thank you, Alper. We just have a couple of minutes left, so I'd like to put one final question to both of you, because we talked about low-hanging fruits in this relationship. But where do you see the biggest challenge or the potential biggest catastrophe that could happen to the detriment of this already rather difficult relationship with the incoming Trump administration? Maybe you'd like to start, Alper, then we can go to Aaron.
Yeah, there are a lot of fantastic disaster scenarios that are being voiced in terms of what might transpire between Turkey and Israel now that they have become neighbors, if you will, in Syria. That is a significant potential tripwire, in my view, that can blow out of proportion. Any hot conflict in the Trump administration with Iran, which again, as far as diminishing Iran's clout in the region, Turkey would welcome, but in terms of all the fallout effects it would not want, is another area where I think you could have significant challenges in the relationship.
The way I describe it is paranoia and dysfunction. There is extreme paranoia at elements, the high levels of the Turkish government about broader US intentions, and the inability to grapple with the very real thing that happens in such a large bureaucracy, which is just incompetence or unintended consequences, or left hand not knowing what the right hand is doing, and problems arising and then trying to resolve them sort of in ways that are politically acceptable in the country. So that's on the Turkish side, and that manifests itself in the Israel scenario to me, but also in the Iran scenario that Alper was talking about. On the US side, it's the dysfunction side. It's that in a government that we will have in 5 days, where elements of the ruling party do not agree with each other on execution of US foreign policy. To say what you will about the Biden administration, whatever you think of it, this is not political. They all basically agreed on the direction of US foreign policy, strengthening US alliances with Europe, deepening US presence in the Indo-Pacific, and obviously confronting Russia. There was no such cohesion on the Republican side. And that is what caused so many issues in the US-Turkish relationship in the first Trump administration, and I don't expect those to be really any different this time around. And so it's the paranoia on the Turkish side, and it will be the dysfunction on the American side that prevents sort of, if you're an academic or a policymaker, or a policy analyst or a think tanker, we just get paid to sit around and write things. Seems simple. The actual excellence, the execution of this becomes more challenging because of the cast of characters involved.
Thank you. You make it sound like a soap opera that's about to go into the second series. Yeah.
You've seen the movie before.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, unfortunately, we have to come to an end because we've run out of time. I knew this was going to be a fascinating discussion, and I think I was right. I want to thank both of you so very, very much, because I feel like we've covered a lot of topics in 1 hour. Probably many of these topics deserve to be covered in other seminars. But I think this was a great launch to our event series. So thank you very much for joining us. We'll all be keeping an eye on Türkiye-US relations. Just for the audience, thank you very much for joining us. I can already flag up that the next event in this series will be on the 4th of February, and it will actually be looking at Türkiye-Syria relations. We've touched on that a bit today, but I think there's plenty of space to really dig deep and get into more details, because it's very much a moving issue, if I can put it that way, literally every half hour. So thanks again to you both, Aaron and Alper, and I look forward to having you again on a future deep dive into Turkish foreign policy. Thank you, and good afternoon to everyone, or good morning to the US as well. Bye-bye.